Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Dax, which is episode 7 of season 1 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Star Trek Deep Space Nine, right here. Here's the station. Anyway, this video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Deep Space Nine, one episode at a time. In this video, I cover episode 7, Dax. So Dax is the episode where a team of aliens come on board and try to abduct Dax, but Cisco stops them, but they find out that they're actually doing a legal extradition as they accuse Dax of murder and they want to extradite her, and they have a treaty with the Federation. However, Cisco wonders, if they have a treaty, why didn't they just go up and say so in the first place? Why try to abduct her? And he realizes it's because they don't have a treaty with the Bajorans, and it is a Bajoran space station, and so he brings that up. And the Bajorans don't give them permission to extradite Dax, and so they need to have an extradition hearing, in which case Cisco makes the argument that the crime in question was committed by Curzon Dax, and so he makes the argument that Jadzia Dax is a different person, whereas the guy trying to extradite her makes the argument that the Dax symbiont is still there, so still liable and still guilty of the crime. Well, Odo does some investigating and then brings back the widow of the murder victim in question, and we find out that Dax was actually innocent of the crime because Dax has an alibi, and that is the widow who Dax was sleeping with at the time. So she kind of disgraces herself in the memory of her husband, who apparently is seen as a hero but was actually not a hero, and the one responsible for betraying their side to the rebels in the first place, and they killed him for it, but nobody wants to hear that because they see them as a hero. But either way, Dax is off the hook and the day is saved. So, this is an episode that I think it's most known for. A lot of people that I heard talk about this episode will say it's most known for, it's called Dax, and it's supposed to be about Jadzia Dax, but we actually don't learn anything about Dax, and Jadzia herself spends the whole episode being quiet and not saying anything, and so we don't actually see her interact in this episode, nor do we learn all that much about her. Now, we do learn a little bit about her because she does have a bit at the end saying that all the fields that she studied in Jadzia specifically before she was joined, and how she was an expert in exobiology and all these other sciences, and that was her, not the Dax symbiont. And we learn a bit more about Curzon, how he was, kind of like the drink and was a bit of a ladies' man, kind of like to break the rules. So I think this is the first episode that really established that. But we don't actually see Dax's character that much, and the episode is more about explaining the Trill than it is about exploring Dax's character, because it explores the philosophical question of, is Jadzia a new and different person? And I just find it hard to believe that Trill Society doesn't have precedent for this, it doesn't have laws. I mean, they've been around for a long time. They should have official hearings on if a joined host could be found liable for the actions of a previous host from the same symbiont. That should be an issue that should have been addressed by now. So they should have just been able to turn to especially they had an expert from Trill there on the station because the bad guy, what's his face, brought him with him in order to identify Dax. So he should have been able to say, well, in Trill Society, we do hold hosts accountable for the acts of their previous hosts, or we don't hold them. Like, they should have known. And the Federation has a long-standing relationship with the Trill. They've obviously been around for a long time, which we'll find out more in the season 2 episode Blood Oath. They've been around for at least 100 years and known to the Federation. And so they should know all about this. This shouldn't be a mystery of whether or not a host can be held liable for the acts of her previous host. So it was all kind of an excuse to just have exposition about the Trill to explain it to the audience. That's mainly what I see this episode as, is a big excuse to, alright, let's do a trial episode. And by the way, it's the typical wrongfully accused trial episode cliche that we've seen in Star Trek so many times. And it's not a particularly good one, to be honest, because I don't know, it's just frustrating that Jadzia is just being quiet the whole time. Now, again, that's done for plot convenience so that they can have all this exposition about the Trill. And so what they make very clear is that the Trill have been heavily retconned from the episode The Host. And I talked about this before when I covered The Host, that they should have just called the Trill something else when they made DS9, because they are in no way, shape, or form the same species. One way. They both have a symbiont, and they're both a joined species, but that's it. They should have just used that as a jumping off point to be like, oh, well, let's create a new species, alien race that's kind of like the Trill, but different. And they should have just called them something else. Because for one thing, the Federation barely had any contact with the Trill. They were aware of them, but they didn't even know they were joint species, and that's retconned because Cisco is well aware of this, decades earlier. And so, yeah, it retcons that, but the main thing it retcons, and this was made more clear in a deleted scene from The Host, but you also get that from the episode itself, is that they portrayed the Trill as the symbiont completely takes control of the body, and the host personality essentially dies when they are joined and is overridden by the symbiont, who is in control of the body. Udan in that episode made it clear that, I am Udan. This body you see is just a host. Whereas here, I actually prefer what they do with the Trill here, but again, it's a complete, they retconned absolutely everything, even their appearance, so they should have just called them a different species. But anyway, But I like how they're portrayed better in DS9, so don't get me wrong, I love the retcons. I just think that call them something else. That's the easiest fix. But anyway, how they're portrayed here is that they're a joined species. So when a symbiont joins with a host, they join their personalities and create a new person. And so when the symbiont leaves and goes to another host, the symbiont is still the symbiont, but it joins with a different host, so you have a different pairing. I'm trying to think of a effective metaphor, but I can't think of one. They mentioned in the episode something about it's like linking two computers together, and I suppose that to follow that metaphor is if you unlink those computers and then take that one of the computers and link it up with a different computer, it will come up with a different joined outcome, but it will carry on all the stuff in that one computer to the new joining. I don't know if that's a good metaphor, but regardless, it makes perfect sense to me. I've actually heard some people complain that they didn't think that the Trills or how they're portrayed in DS9 make a lot of sense. But I think this episode actually does it as, it's just an excuse to explain the Trill, but I think it does a good job at it. I think it makes it very clear, and that remains true going forward, because some people seem to be confused and didn't understand, like, how they have the memories of the other hosts, but then they're not that host. Do they have these people inside of them? But no, it's the symbiont has the memories of all the lives it lived before, and each time it was joined with a person, it had a different joint personality, but the symbiont carries, and I'm sure the symbiont's personality is shaped through the different hosts that it has, but it basically has the memories of being in these hosts, but it's not like having the different people inside their head. It's not like Jadzia has multiple personalities and talks to Curzon and Tobin, and they're all like certain different as personalities in their head talking. It's nothing like that. To me, it's quite simple. I mean, I'm not that good at explaining it, but I totally get it. Is that, and I think this episode does a really good job of explaining it. Is that it's a joining, and so every time the symbiont joins with a different host, it creates new personality, but the symbiont carries those experiences and the memories of each of the joining with them, but it still has its own personality that will be changed with every new host. So Jadzia Dax is a joining between Jadzia and her personalities and her 20 years of life that came before, and the Dax symbiont has his personality, and they join together. Now, the Dax symbiont's personality is shaped through all the different hosts that they had in the past, because each experience will shape, just like in real life, experiences will shape one's personalities, but it still has its own distinct personality that it joins with each host, and their distinct personality, which creates a new distinct personality. I don't know if that was explained very well. Maybe people who were confused are still confused, but I totally get it. It makes perfect sense to me, and so I don't know why some people are confused about it. I think the episode was quite clear. Now, it does create sort of an interesting dilemma, and that's why it was such a hard dilemma for the hearing for the arbiter to make, because couldn't decide if Jadzia should be held liable for Curzon's experience, because Jadzia Dax, as Sisko's argument is saying, is a distinct new person, because the Dax symbiont was joined with Curzon before, which created a new personality, and that's gone. That unique being is gone, but the Dax symbiont carried those memories and those experiences onto Jadzia, so it does retain some of the part of Curzon, but in a new being. And so it's, and the arbiter said something like, so all we got to do is separate the symbiont from the host and send the symbiont back to Trill, and the host can stay here. And Bashir is like, it's not that simple. And I love her responses, oh, what a surprise. And so it does create a complex dilemma. But of course, the dilemma is kind of weakened in this episode because of the fact that we, the audience, know for a fact that Curzon's innocent and didn't commit murder. And because Sisko's convinced, and of course we know Sisko's right, and we know that our main character, even though we just met her and we don't know much about her, that they're not going to say that she's her previous host was a murderer. So we know that's bullshit. So it kind of deflates some of that power of that dilemma, because the dilemma would actually be more interesting if it was true, if the Dax symbiont had actually committed a crime. But that's not getting into the whole Oh God, what's the name of that one host they'll introduce in season 3? That's a murderer. And not even Jadan. Was that his name? Yeah, it's not even getting into that whole thing. That was something else entirely. And it was a bit more complicated. But anyway, yeah. But it's obvious that dilemma was just there to, as I say, throw exposition at the audience about what the trills are, which I think is an effective way to do it. It's better than having two people in the room saying, so what you're saying is, well, they kind of did do that with the trial, but still, at least they had a plot of a trial, even though the plot was kind of predictable. Every time they talk about the civil war between the aliens, I can't remember their names. The one that the bad guy was from, and his mother. Every time they talked about that Civil War, I always pictured the American Civil War, and I think since this is like Western theme, which I talked about in previous episodes, especially the early season of DS9 was very modeled off of a Western. I feel like they were modeling this Civil War off of the American Civil War, so I always picture, the guy who was killed, the father of the prosecutor guy. I always picture him like a Colonel Custard type with the long white hair and a pointy beard. Or more like a goatee, a pointy goatee, but whatever, you know what I'm saying. But it always evokes that kind of image for me. So one of the strengths of this episode, one of the things that I liked it the most for, that made me enjoy it a lot, was the strength of its guest actors. It had memorable guest actors. I believe, if I remember correctly, even though I had seen some of them before, I didn't really recognize them when I first saw this episode, but when I saw them later, I was like, hey, they were in Dax. Most of all is Gregory Itzin, who plays the prosecutor guy, Tandro. He was actually really good in this role. He really played that despicable sort of, I bet you have figured out, Commander, that our extradition treaty is valid with the Federation. Like, the way he's, like, slimy, whatever. He was, like, so good in this role, so that's probably why I recognized him. Now, he appeared in Star Trek a couple more times. He played in DS9 later on in Who Mourns for Morn. And I recognized him immediately. He played one of Morn's associates that was trying to get his money. And then he appeared in the Voyager episode Critical Care as one of the doctors. He's kind of slimy there as well. And then a couple appearances in Enterprise. I think one time he was a Vulcan. But the main thing that I know him from, and the main thing that most people know him from, is playing President Logan on 24, who was the main villain for several seasons. He would actually reoccur. He's one of those characters that they loved, so they brought him back, and that was probably his biggest role. He was really, really good in that role. And I've seen him in other stuff too, I'm sure, but he's always like a really good actor. But I think I might go as far as to say that this is his best, or at least my favorite, of his Star Trek appearances. I think he has a lot more to do in this episode than something like Critical Care. And he was okay in Who Mourns for Morn, but I think he fits his role so much better. Like, he just fits it so well. Like, the scenes where him and Cisco are, like, arguing over the trial, whatever, like, are so good. Like, he really sells them. So The other actor I recognize the most would be, I cannot pronounce her first name, but I believe her last name is Flanagan. Fionla might be her first name. Anyway, I didn't really know her by name. I know her by face. She was in a couple other Star Trek episodes as well. She played Data's mother in the 7th season of TNG, which I haven't gotten to yet because it actually aired later. And she played the Vulcan, T'Pol's Vulcan mentor in the episode Forgotten Hero, which is one of the few episodes of Season 1 of Enterprise that I actually like, and she did a good job in that. It might be my favorite of Season 1, actually. Well, that and Shockwave. But again, what I really know her from is Lost. She played Mrs. Hawkins on Lost, and if you've seen Lost, you know who I'm talking about because she didn't appear that much, but when she did, it was like such a powerful role, such a very interesting character that everyone's talking about, and she does such a damn good job at it, and so that's definitely what I know her from. And then there's Anne Haney, who I mainly recognize from Liar Liar, which came out after this, where she played, because I was working at the movie theater when Liar Liar came out, so I saw it over and over and over and over again. It's not that great of a movie, but it's just because I was working at the theater, so I recognize her most from that movie, playing Jim Carrey's secretary. But she also appeared in Star Trek earlier, which I didn't recognize until someone mentioned it. And I was like, oh yeah, no, that is her. She appeared in one of my favorite, one of the most underrated episodes of TNG, The Survivors. She played Rashawn Osprey, one of the survivors. And I was like, oh yeah, that's right, that was her. And then there's Richard Lineback, who plays the Trill specialist. He looked familiar, but I looked him up and I didn't really find anything I recognized him from, except earlier episode of TNG, the season 1 episode Symbiosis. He played one of the drug addicts. The other one was played by David Marcus, Kirk's son. Well, and he played the other one. I was like, oh yeah, that was him. But no, I really liked Anne Haney as the I was gonna want to call her judge, but it's not really a judge. It's officially the arbiter. She's does such a good job. She was like, I'm supposed to, I want to be here till supper, not senility. She's just very curt. And then that point when Cisco and the Tandro guy were start yelling at each other, she was like, I said this would be informal, not riotous. I don't know, it's a very simple role, but all these good actors, they brought 4 great actors, well 3 in particular, brought them in, and it just, for me, that's what elevates the episode even more so than the writing. I think the writing is actually kind of cliche and kind of bland, but those actors really elevate the script. And yeah, I really hated the fact that Jadzia wouldn't talk the whole time. It seemed like plot convenience, and at the end we find out that she's just hiding the fact. She doesn't want to disgrace this woman who had an affair with her husband, who was seen as a war hero, and she wanted to hide the fact that their husband was actually the one who betrayed their side, and he was killed by the rebels for it. Yeah, I'm not really buying it. I'm sorry. I think her silence was just the plot contrivance to push the plot forward, and it just made me it's frustrating watching the scenes with her, and I'm like, just say something. And I think this is before they really developed the character of Jadzia very well, and this seems, what they do with her in the future, this seems out of character just from retrospect. It's just clear that they didn't really know what to do with her, and they were playing her in a different way. They're playing her as kind of sort of wise and reserved, which I don't get because they make it clear in this episode that Curzon was rambunctious and a ladies' man, where she was like, oh, Trills don't even have relationships, and they're just using it as an excuse for her to reject Julian. But by the way, at the start of the episode when Julian was hitting on her hard out, even going as far as to go when she leaves, she's like, oh, he said it wasn't necessary, but she didn't say it was forbidden, and goes to follow her to her quarters. That's creepy. Like, that's very creepy behavior. It's like following someone home. Like, yeah, it's creepy. Like, it's like stalking almost. Well, maybe not that, but of course this also was done for plot convenience, so he could find the people trying to abduct her and try to stop them. Although I will say something that's very frustrating about this scene that a lot of other people pointed out is that he sees people trying to abduct Jadzia. So the first thing he does is charges at one of them with like a two-handed thing and like punches them, and then gets in a fight with this woman, and then once he sees it's a woman he hesitates, so she kicks his ass. But the thing that really gets me is that his first reaction to seeing people trying to abduct Dax should have been Bashir to Ops. People are trying to abduct Dax, and it's the dumbest thing. It makes him out to be a moron that wasn't his first reaction. That should have been his very first reaction. And maybe it shows him as like hot-headed or foolhardy, that his instinct is just to charge and fight people, even though he's a doctor. I don't know. I still feel like it would have made a lot more sense if his first reaction was to actually report this. And instead, he gets his ass kicked, and he waits until he comes to, and then he calls ops, and so now these abductors have a head start on them. Good job, Bashir, you fucking idiot. So that's a bit frustrating. But that being said, I did like the abduction scene. I actually think it was a high point of the episode. I think after the abduction, the episode kind of gets kind of tedious. Because it's funny, because I watched a review where they kind of said the opposite, that they thought the whole abduction thing was boring and the low point of the episode. I think it was a high point of the episode. I love the way it was playing out. It's very exciting, and how they sabotaged the tractor beam, and Cisco got it working again at the last second, was able to grab the ship. Like, it was exciting. I liked it. But several things bothered me afterwards, because when they come off the ship, the guy goes up to Cisco and is like, I need to talk to you. I have this extradition treaty. And no one's like putting him in handcuffs. Like, Odo's not like, he should be shoving him into the brig. And when he says, I need to talk to you, Cisco's response should be, yeah, I'll meet you in the brig, asshole. Like, you're under fucking arrest, you dickhead. That should have been the reaction. But outside of that, when the guy was like, oh, we have this treaty and it's expedition and this is all legal, Cisco should have been like, you sabotaged our tractor beam and made it malfunction. You assaulted one of my officers, so I'm charging you with those things. Maybe after, you can send someone else to pick up Dax, or you can wait till after you served your sentence or after you've been seen by a judge. But I'm charging you under like this expedition treaty doesn't give you a right to sabotage my space station and assault one of my officers. So you're under fucking arrest for that, and then we can worry about this expedition. Like, that should have been Cisco's response. But again, plot. Had to get things moving along. But I did like the reveal. I'd love the scene with him and Kira. What's his face? Tandro and Cisco and Kira in the office, where Cisco was like, I've been trying to figure out why you didn't just come up and ask for Jadzia, and his response was, well, I'm sure you have figured out that our treaty is valid and whatever. And again, as I said, the actor does such a good job. But then Sisko is like, then I remembered it's the Bajoran space station, and you don't have a treaty with the Bajoran. He's like, I don't think that's relevant. And you know that he's lying. And I love this because it makes it clear that's exactly why they... Because some people are like, oh, that's silly why he tried to abduct her. But actually, it makes perfect sense. They were purposely trying to avoid a headache because they knew it was a Bajoran space station. They purposely wanted to avoid it, especially since apparently, and this is interesting, that they're kind of allies with the Cardassians, and that's something that, as Kira says, annoys them. And I love that. That scene with Kira was so great when Kira started questioning him. It was like, I'm having a conversation with Sisko. And he's like, no, now your conversation's with my first officer. And I love that sort of team up and how Sisko and Kira were like teaming up. It's one of the great early examples of Sisko and Kira sort of teaming up to take him on. So that was great. I love that. And then later when Sisko was using Kira and Bashir to do some investigating, how, Sisko told Kira to find out any precedents for, Trill, are they responsible for the previous host? And by the way, as I mentioned, I don't buy that she didn't find any precedent. Its precedent should have been pretty fucking easy to find. But anyway, she was like, well, what if I find that they are? The answer is yes, that they are responsible for the actions of previous hosts. He's like, then that's a wrong answer. From now on, our answer is no. But if you do find a wrong answer, I need to know about it. Like, that was cool. I love that. That was like this good, like, commanding officer type thing from Sisko. Like, yeah, I just... Yes, and stuff like that makes me really like the episode. So, the opening scene, though, when they're in ops and they're trying to get the ship, like, Dax keeps, not Dax, but, like, Kira and other people and Sisko were doing things that, like, O'Brien should be doing. I'm like, why are they doing this? Like, this should be O'Brien's job. And then I realized, Meany must be filming a movie. And I think, yeah, so this is in his contract because he liked doing, like, mainly, like, Irish indie movies. I remember seeing him one. I can't remember what it was called. It was something about, a young girl getting pregnant, where he played the father. It was an Irish movie. I didn't think it was all that good, but I think maybe that's the one that he was making, because I think it came out around this time. But later on, he would actually do some big movies. Like, the biggest one I remember him being in is what is it? Con Air. That's right. He was also in Die Hard 2, but that was before this. But he had a fairly major role in Con Air. He played the asshole cop that the good guy cop hated. They, like, fucked up his car. I think he was doing an American accent, too, and it seems so weird. But, yeah, so he liked to do a lot of movies, so he had it in his contract that he could. Like, that was part of the agreement because they really wanted him for Deep Space Nine. As I said, they wanted Michelle Forbes and she turned it down. But Colin Meaney, apparently, he said, oh, I'll do Deep Space Nine on the condition that I can leave to do movies whenever. Because that was a sticking point for Will Wheaton, as I talked about. That's why he quit TNG's, because Rick Berman wouldn't let him leave to do a movie. And he's like, oh, you got a very important role in this episode. You can't go do a movie. And then they cut him out of the episode and he only had 2 lines. What a dick Rick Berman was. Like, I'd quit too. I totally owned Will Wheaton's side. But apparently with Colm Meaney, he wanted to avoid that. So he said, on one condition, I'll do Deep Space Nine on the condition that you'll let me leave and do movies. So in this case, they're like, okay, fine. And in fact, I watched a podcast with Terry Farrell, and she was saying that she didn't have that privileged. She wasn't able to do movies or other projects, and there were other people who worked on DS9 who also had that issue, which is interesting. And she said other actors were able to do movies and other projects, but some weren't. So that's kind of interesting. It was probably all had to do with contract negotiations or whatnot. But anyway, he will be absent, I believe, for the next 2 episodes as well. The Passenger and Move Along Home. Are those the next 2? I think so. Because I know they brought in that security guy, Preman, to take his place, but he's only in those 2 episodes. But yeah, I think they did, in fact, mention at the start, Dax, I think, mentioned in the very first scene that Chief O'Brien was visiting. He was with Keiko visiting her mother for her 100th birthday. And, a lot of people were puzzled by that, saying Keiko's not that old and that her mother had to be 60 or in her 60s when she gave birth to Keiko. But it's future technology, so maybe that's actually possible in this scenario. So yeah, next DS9's episode is Passenger Move Along Home. Yeah, and I think he's gone for the Negus as well. Is he? Or does he come? Is that the one? No, I think he might be back for that. I think that's the one where he's the substitute teacher. I don't know. I can't remember. I'll figure it out when I watch it. Anyway, I would now like to thank all my Patreon supporters for supporting me on Patreon. It's very much appreciated. It does help me continue with my channel. I'd like to give a big special thanks to Brandon Nilhouse. Thank you so much for your support. And I would also like to give a shout out to Antarius, Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Manny Jester, Joel Valls, Alessandro Miguelesio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. So we have a few patron comments on this episode. First comment is from Kyrie091, who says, Dax, more like wax. Like spelled W-A-C-K-S, just to be clear. Anyway, this is one where they sort of out if Jadzia is responsible for the actions of a previous host, right? The episode has some great parts and some stuff that helps build the universe and explain the Trill a bit, but I find it strains credibility to believe that they have never adjudicated this question before Jadzia Dax. Like, this planet has done the symbiont thing for hundreds/thousands of years, and they're just now getting around to sorting out if a host is responsible for the actions of their previous hosts. The question had never come up before now. It doesn't take away from the good parts of the episode, but that was my first reaction. I'll tell you what they need to adjudicate on DS9. Let's call a hearing to order to figure out who wrote Vic Fontaine's A Holosuite program. Let's find that guy and fire a full spread of photon torpedoes. So the answer to that is Felix, is who we never seen on screen but is mentioned all the time. It's kind of like Norm's wife, I guess, or Niall's wife from Frasier. Anyway, so let's fire some photon torpedoes at Felix. I almost said Neelix. That's a different topic. Anyway, yes, absolutely, you're correct. They should have adjudicated this before 100%. How they now just figuring this shit out, that is a very good point. Anyway, next comment is from Ricky, who says, this is an okay episode. There are some intriguing parts to the episode, like the exploration of the Trill. Should a host be responsible for the actions of the symbiont? years ago was actually interesting. I feel that this was a social commentary for the people who served in Nazi Germany and in other wars where some people did terrible things such as murder, where in some cases they were forced through the orders of their superiors and were tried in courts for those actions in the past. And this is the feeling I get from this episode. Also, I just found out that DC Fontana wrote this episode, which I thought she just wrote for TOS, but it wasn't one of the best though. Although I don't buy that Dax wouldn't tell Cisco since they were buddies for a long time. I felt like this was out of character for Dax, and the reveal wasn't that big of a deal, so an okay episode. My rating is a 6 out of 10. Yeah, I'm not sure if I agree that the Nazi Germany analogy really holds, because in this case, I mean, I see what you're saying about trying someone years after the fact, but this case it was an older person who say, oh, this old man is not really the same as the young man he used to be, and he was just following orders. So yeah, okay, I can see a little bit of similarity there, but I think it's actually entirely different because they bring the sci-fi thing of they actually change bodies and actually become a different person. But the major difference is in this case, Dax is actually innocent. Even the previous host, Curzon, was innocent and didn't actually do anything wrong. It was set up by... So I feel like it's more of a Civil War analogy, actually. But that is just me. That if that works for you, then it works for you. Now, as for DC Fontana, yeah, I did forget to mention her. It's very interesting that she wrote this episode. She actually she was the showrunner for the animated series for a while. If you count that as a separate show, I really count it as like a subsection of the original series, personally. But she also wrote for season 1 of TNG. Don't have the list of the episodes she wrote. I know that she wrote Encounter at Farpoint and The Naked Now, and in both cases was heavily rewritten by Gene Roddenberry to the point she was very pissed off and didn't really see it as her episode anymore. I can't remember if she wrote any other episodes for season 1 of TNG, but I do remember that she quit in season 1 of TNG, so she didn't do any later seasons. So this is the only episode that she wrote for DS9. This will be the last episode that she wrote for Star Trek. So it's interesting there was that huge break, and I guess they convinced her to come back and do this one episode. One interesting thing, though, is I remember before she passed away, obviously, there was a interview with her where she revealed that as a fan, as an audience member, Deep Space Nine was her favorite Star Trek show. And that is very interesting because, she was one of the heavy influences of the original series, but maybe because she knew of all the behind the scenes of the original series and all the writing of it, and maybe early TNG as well. That's why she didn't think as highly of those shows, whereas this was the only show she wrote for, only episode she wrote for DS9. But yeah, she just said it was the superior show because of the characters and and the intrigue. So yeah, that's actually very interesting. Anyway, next comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who says, we get 2 good actresses, Anne Haney and Irish legend Fiona Flanagan. I won't get a chance to watch this episode before this comment. I would agree that Dax should have told Cisco what is going on. However, I can accept it as it was an early episode like A Man Alone. As we know where Cisco and Dax's story arc go in the future, it wouldn't make sense within this episode. It works for season 1, it wouldn't work in season 3. I like Ricky's comparing the Trill to an average Nazi soldier. I do agree with the Trill should have been a different alien race. However, that crap TNG episode should have had a different alien instead of the Trill. The Trill and TNG feel like slavery to me, as the host seems to have no control over the symbiont. I know I said Riker just agreed so he could have sex with Beverly. I just can't pass on the opportunity to rip Riker. The Trill in DS9 is way better. Once joined, the host and symbiont depend on each other, so my rating is 7 times. Odo will have to teach Worf how to be a better security officer out of 10. Yeah, like Worf never does like this kind of investigating that Odo does. He doesn't go. I never see him go to a planet and dig up the evidence and talk to witnesses. Well, maybe he does talk to witnesses occasionally, but I don't know. He was more of like your typical security guard, like a turnkey, rather than like a detective, like Odo is portrayed as. But anyway, Yes, you absolutely take any opportunity you can to rip into Riker. I have noticed that. But it is humorous, I will say. But yeah, and I also agree that the hosts, in the episode, the host of Trill portrayed kind of like the Goa'uld from Stargate SG-1, where they were just like, where they were portrayed as quite evil and not giving a shit about human beings and just taking over their bodies and using them as hosts. And the Trill wasn't exactly like that, especially they weren't evil warlords who wanted to conquer the galaxy. But it does seem more like that they were just completely a parasite. I think someone explained the difference, because in the host they referred to them as a symbiont, but actually wasn't a symbiont, it was a parasite, because it completely took over the body, whereas the Trill, as they're portrayed here, is a symbiont because they have a symbiosis. They have a joining with the host, and they equal parts control the body. So no, I agree that retcon was amazing, and I even said this, that I like what they did with the Trill and DS9 much better. They retconned them so much is that they should have just called them something else. But that's kind of a nitpick. That's kind of, splitting hairs. All in all, I do like what they did with the Trill in this episode. Anyway, next comment is from Norman Buckwald, who says, "Wow, what a treat. We get both Rashan and Data's mother from TNG, the later also known as T'Pol's fallen hero and most famously as Lost Eloise Hawking. Get your impression ready in the next sentence, Mark. I enjoyed immensely Rashan as the somewhat tempered judge who thankfully didn't suddenly vanish, and we get Eloise Hawking, who told Dax to have an affair with Curzon, must do what he is supposed to do. We also get the last known Star Trek franchise script written by DC Fontana, and we learn a little bit more about Curzon, while much to our surprise, for some odd reason, the Trill haven't made a clear criteria what is supposed to do related to previous crimes, which, considering one of Dax's supposed hosts is considered as considering Dax could have been tried for those actual murders. As for Terry Farrell, well, she mainly sits there because I guess Jadzia, in agreement with the Dax symbiont, is going to protect her previous affair, but it's ironic how little we get, especially we get to learn about Jadzia and Curzon, only to have been engaged in an affair, and I guess his role of diplomat with regards to politics, i.e. the Riker method of diplomacy. That's an interesting way to put it. At least Kira can boast for once she was not abducted, although considering how often Kira is abducted in the series, it's surprising considering all her years being active in the Shakar resistance cell. But could Dax even be abducted this easily given all the lifetime of experience? Still, loved the solution that that this would be tried in a Bajoran court, honoring the Bajoran station and not having Starfleet be involved. Definitely shows some uniqueness being given to DS9. As for the episode at large, as interesting as the courtroom dramas are in Trek, with Measure of the Man and Ad Astra, Per Spera, and Drumhead being perhaps the classics, this one unfortunately is more meh. Maybe it was too early in Trill lore to bring this up, especially the head scratching being there's no solution. Perhaps to separate out the host, this is not getting involved with crimes of previous hosts, may be similar to no relationships with former host partners as per their code. But that's attempting a headcanon for what we know later and not at the time of this episode. Still, having both Rashawn and Eloise Hawkins in this episode, with both acting their roles well, does make this episode above average for sure. I'll give it 6.5 Bajoran ball gavels out of 10. It's funny because it is Rashawn, but I didn't even notice that the actress was Rashawn until it was pointed out to me, and that's one of my favorite episodes. So it's weird that I didn't quite make the connection. I actually think of her more as the secretary from Liar Liar. That's what I recognize. I recognize her from Liar Liar from this episode, like immediately. Oh, that's the secretary from Liar Liar. But in Survivors, I didn't connect the two. I think maybe her hairdo was the same here as in Liar Liar. Maybe that's why. I don't know. But yeah, in the previous comment, Stephen Kennedy mentioned that Fiona Flanagan, or however you pronounce her name, was an Irish legend. Well, that's news to me. I thought she was English. That's probably blasphemy for me to say, and I apologize. But I did not know that. Her accent sounds English to me. But anyway, and again, that's probably blasphemy again. But yeah, not do it because you want to. You do it because you're supposed to. Anyway. Yeah, I will never not think of her as Eloise Hawkins. Even though I did recognize her before Lost came out. Like, when Lost came out, I was like, oh yeah, I recognize that actress. But for me, that's always her most outstanding role. And of course, you also bring up the same points everyone else is making. How come there's no precedent for that? Which is, I think, a major plot hole to this episode. So I think there's a reason everyone keeps bringing it up. But yeah, this definitely does not hang with the classic courtroom Star Trek episodes such as Measure of Man, Ad Astra, Per Spera, and Drumhead. You know, I agree those three are probably the best trial episodes. If we're not doing Falsely Accused, because none of those are Falsely Accused episodes. I know one time we tried to like nitpick Nix and tried to be like, oh well, maybe, you know, because Ad Astra or Per Spera is not a falsely accused episode because she's actually guilty of what they're accusing her of. The problem is if what they're accusing her of is not really a crime, and that's where the dilemma comes in. It's more similar to Measure of Man in that regard, where this is a falsely accused episode, which those are never as good as of trial episodes where there's like a murder and someone, like we just had one a couple episodes ago too with A Man Alone and where someone is accidentally accused of murder that they clearly didn't commit. And this is more complicated because they're accusing her previous host of a murder he didn't commit, but still is still the character essentially being accused of a murder they didn't commit. So it's a falsely accused episode, and that's a cliche that just doesn't work as well as a trial episode. I still say A Matter of Perspective is my favorite one of those. But anyway. Next comment is from Antarius, who says, I like the chase scene at the beginning, but what kind of government would approve such a treaty, making it legal to kidnap their own citizens instead of having any kind of formal procedures? Another example of Federation diplomacy, whose first principle is too often to give the other side everything they demand. I also liked the legal question at the center of this episode, but since, contrary to what TNG told us, the Trill are long integrated into the Federation, there should be clear legal precedent already. Sadly, the question isn't resolved at the end. Why do they need Quark's bar for the hearing? At no time more than 6 to 8 people are present at the same time. I can't believe there was no other room on the station big enough for this number of people. The out-of-universe explanation is, of course, that they didn't want to build another set, but it really annoyed me that, again, a main character is accused of a serious crime. And did Dax really want to die just to protect Nana Tendro's reputation? The secret of her husband's being the traitor is not at risk of being revealed. My rating is a weak 6 out of 10. So, yeah, you hit the nail on the head on why exactly they needed to have the hearing at Quark's bar. It's because they didn't want to build another set. They wanted to use the pre-existing set. That is the only reason. And also they had an excuse to have that scene with Odo blackmailing Quark, and that was this episode. I accidentally mentioned that in the previous episode. It was actually this one, and I love that scene. That was a really good scene. And when Quark's like, no, you can't use my bar, business is business, and Odo's like started to blackmail him. It's like, this is blackmail, and Odo's like, no, it's business, and business is business. Like, so we get a good scene out of it, so I'll excuse them being too cheap to build another set. It's funny because later in the show there will be a conference lounge, but I think that was introduced in season 3. They retroactively try to pretend like it was there the whole time, but we never actually see it before. And I do get that they just started the show and they just spent like millions of dollars building all these sets. Like the promenade was huge, and how they're like, yeah, we can't justify building another set just for this one episode. So I'm okay with it. Yeah, it's kind of silly to have it at Quark's bar. And also later on, there's an episode, what's it called? Rules of Engagement, where Worf is put on trial. That's another stupid falsely accused episode, which is much worse, but I'll get to that when I get to it. They actually do have a room specifically for the trial, for the hearing. So why couldn't they do that here as well? It's because of the money, Lebowski. They didn't want to build another set. That's the only reason. But I did have that for that good scene with Odo, so I will excuse it for that. But yeah, you also bring up a really good point about the extradition. So here's the thing. I'm gonna headcanon this myself and kind of make up some stuff, but it kind of makes sense to me. Like my in-universe excuse as to what happened here. I don't think that their agreement with the government allowed them to kidnap citizens. What I think happened is, well, the whatever the hell those aliens are called, Tandro and his people, they knew that they might try to use the Bajoran excuse if they tried to do the extradition through formal legal procedures, and so they decided to do the abduction instead, but pretend that the abduction was legal, because he was like, oh, look, I have this legal document saying that she can be extradited, so therefore it's legal. But in actuality, it's not legal, which is what I think Sisko pins him down for. Now, Sisko, as I mentioned earlier, he could charge him with like sabotaging the station, with attacking a Starfleet officer, but that wouldn't change the fact that legally he could still extradite Dax. So he would just have to come back to Deep Space Nine to face charges for that shit, and he could probably get like a weak penalty because the fucking Federation. But that wouldn't stop him from taking Dax. So I think maybe that's why Sisko didn't bother filing charges, because I think in my headcanon he would be in his right to file charges, even though they were legally extraditing Dax. The way he did it was illegal, but filing those charges would do nothing to stop him from taking Dax. So I think that's why he didn't care about filing charges, because he was more concerned about stopping him from taking Dax. But I think realistically he should have filed the charges anyway, just to be spiteful. I think that would have been in Sisko's character, but that's my headcanon. Maybe the episode is trying to tell us that what he did abducting her was legal, but in that case, yeah, I would agree that is bullshit. But anyway, thank you so much, patrons, for your comments. So my rating for Dax out of 10 is going to be a 6 good. I was thinking about giving this episode a 7, mainly on the strength of the actors and those few opening scenes, which I really liked. But I think a lot of it was too dull once we got to the trial stuff. And I hated the fact that Jadzia wasn't talking. That was very annoying. And I think the ending revelation of sleeping with the with the wife was kind of cliche. And so it wasn't what I would call an exciting episode. It's not one that I really liked or often want to go back and revisit. But it did have its moments. I love the actor who played the Tondro prosecutor guy. And, of course, the Mrs. Hawkins. Always great seeing her. And the secretary from Liar Liar, and how she was like, I'm not here till senility. So there were cool elements to it, and there were cool scenes, particularly the chase scene at the start was fun, and Kira showing that guy what for was great. But overall, it was a little bit of a dull episode, and it was just an excuse to do exposition on the Trill, and it called Dax, and it didn't really explore her character. Instead, it just gave us a giant exposition dump on what the Trill are, which is needed, but it was probably a little bit clunky the way it was done in this episode. It was too obvious that was the purpose of this episode, but still entertaining, as I said, so I'll give it a 6. So that is it for my review of Dax. So coming up next on my channel this Monday, I'll be covering the 2-part episode Birthright. That's Birthright Parts 1 and 2. Wednesday, as I mentioned, a DS9 episode, The Passenger. Thursday, I'll be over on Patreon to do a revisit, this time revisiting my review for Move Along Home. And then on Saturday, back here on my main channel for another public review for The Nagus. You must obey your Nagus! Anyway, I always think about that. Anyway, be sure to check it out as I continue to cover Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek The Next Generation and many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.